What if the man you waved at every morning while jogging through your peaceful suburban neighborhood was a cold-blooded killer? A man who, while playing the role of a loving husband and father, harbored an obsession with murder so deep it became his profession. Richard Kuklinski wasn't just a hitman, he was a monster hiding in plain sight. And the most terrifying part? He was proud of it. Welcome to the Murder Maze, where today we delve into the bone-chilling story of the Iceman, a man who once claimed to have taken over 200 lives, not just for money, but for pleasure. But how did an innocent child grow into one of the most ruthless killers in American history? What twisted his mind into believing that murder was the answer to everything? Stay with us because this story only gets darker. Richard Leonard Kuklinski was born on April 11, 1935, in Jersey City, New Jersey. His childhood was a nightmare that would shape him into the man he would later become. His father, Stanley Kuklinski, was a raging alcoholic who beat Richard and his siblings with horrifying regularity. His mother, Anna, was no saint either. Despite her religious beliefs, she was cruel and believed pain was the best form of discipline. But nothing could compare to the tragedy that truly shattered Richard's innocence. His older brother, Florian, was beaten to death by their father during one of his drunken fits. The family covered it up, claiming Florian had fallen down the stairs. For young Richard, this moment taught him one thing: violence was power, and those who wielded it could shape reality to their will. Richard's brutal upbringing laid the groundwork for his emotional detachment and lack of empathy. When love and compassion are replaced with cruelty and terror, a child's mind can develop twisted coping mechanisms. For Richard, pain became a tool, one he would later use against others. As Richard grew older, his appetite for violence became insatiable. He began torturing animals, finding pleasure in their suffering. It was a twisted way to regain control, a rehearsal for the cruelty he would later inflict on people. His first confirmed murder occurred when he was just 18. A neighborhood bully had pushed Richard too far. What happened next was nothing short of horrific. Richard beat the man to death with a wooden rod, leaving his body unrecognizable. But instead of feeling remorse, he felt a sense of satisfaction, a twisted high from exerting absolute control. Richard's first murder was driven by anger, not profit. It was personal, which made it even more disturbing. He admitted to enjoying the act of killing, not just for money, but for the thrill of it. From there, Richard's bloodlust only grew. He started working for the DeCavalcante crime family in the late 1950s. His efficiency at killing quickly attracted the attention of the Gambino family, who saw him as a valuable asset. Richard's early murders were acts of rage, but over time his approach became calculated and methodical. This shift from emotional to emotionless killing is a hallmark of psychopathy. Richard no longer saw his victims as people, just obstacles to be removed. By the 1960s, Richard Kuklinski was living two lives. At home, he was the picture-perfect family man. He married Barbara Pedrici in 1961, and together they had 3 children. Their home in Dumont, New Jersey was a classic suburban dream. But behind closed doors, Barbara knew the truth. Richard's temper was unpredictable, his anger often directed at her. Yet his children remained blissfully unaware. To them, Richard was a loving father who would do anything for them. The same man who tucked them in at night was the same man who would later go out and end another person's life with a smile on his face. Shocking. Richard's family had no idea about his double life. They genuinely believed he was just a businessman. Despite his monstrous nature, he insisted he had a moral code. He claimed never to kill women or children, though his definition of innocence was questionable. What made Richard Kuklinski so terrifying was not just his ability to kill, but the methods he used. Guns were too noisy and left evidence, so he preferred more creative techniques: cyanide, strangulation, explosives, and even rats. Yes, rats. Shocking. Richard once locked a man in a cave and let rats eat him alive, just to prove a point. He would freeze his victims' bodies to mask the time of death, earning him the nickname, the Iceman. Richard's creativity in killing wasn't just practical, it was psychological. It allowed him to feel superior to his victims and to the police. Freezing bodies using poison? These were his ways of proving he was always one step ahead. His 3 most famous victims: Paul Hoffman, the deadly deal. Paul Hoffman was a pharmacist desperate to score a cheap deal on prescription drugs he could resell for profit. It was the early 1980s, and Hoffman heard whispers about a man named Richard Kuklinski who could get him high-quality drugs for a low price. What Hoffman didn't realize was that he was walking straight into the jaws of a monster. They arranged to meet on April 29, 1982, at a warehouse Kuklinski frequently used for his dealings. The setup was simple. Hoffman would bring cash, and Kuklinski would hand over the drugs. But there was one problem. There were no drugs. From the moment Hoffman stepped into that warehouse, his fate was already sealed. Kuklinski, knowing Hoffman had brought around $25,000, was determined to make sure the man never left alive. As soon as Hoffman handed over the cash, Kuklinski pulled out a gun and shot him in the chest. But the hitman quickly realized something was wrong. The shot didn't kill Hoffman instantly. Instead, he thrashed around on the warehouse floor, gasping for air and pleading for his life. But Richard Kuklinski had no sympathy to offer. Instead of finishing Hoffman off with another bullet, he chose a more brutal approach. He bludgeoned the man repeatedly until his body went limp. The violence wasn't just efficient, it was a demonstration of Kuklinski's complete lack of empathy. Once Hoffman was dead, Kuklinski disposed of the body in a steel drum, which he then left in a deserted area. To Kuklinski, Hoffman was just another unlucky fool who made the mistake of trusting the wrong man. Kuklinski's choice to bludgeon Hoffman, even after shooting him, reveals a sadistic desire to assert dominance. The way he prolongs the suffering shows he didn't just want the money, he wanted the power to end someone's life on his terms. George Maliban. The Cyanide Experiment. George Maliban was a small-time associate who had worked with Kuklinski before. But like many of Richard's victims, Maliban made the fatal mistake of trusting him. In 1980, the two men met to discuss a business deal that involved pirated tapes. It was supposed to be a simple transaction, but for Kuklinski, it was a test. By this point, Kuklinski had grown bored of conventional killing methods. Guns and knives were too direct, too messy. Instead, he wanted to perfect his use of cyanide, his weapon of choice for quick, undetectable murders. They met in Richard's van, where Kuklinski offered Maliban a sandwich laced with cyanide. To Kuklinski's frustration, Maliban refused the food. So, Richard moved to Plan B. In a casual manner, he pulled out a handgun and shot Maliban in the chest. But the shot wasn't fatal. As Maliban lay bleeding and begging for his life, Kuklinski decided to try his experiment anyway. He took a vial of cyanide and poured it down the man's throat, watching with cold fascination as the poison rapidly ended his suffering. For Kuklinski, this kill was about more than just eliminating a potential problem. It was about perfecting his craft, finding new ways to kill that were cleaner, quicker, and, most importantly, more satisfying. Afterward, Kuklinski dumped Maliban's body near a park in New Jersey. He knew authorities would struggle to identify the cause of death, especially with cyanide coursing through the man's veins. Kuklinski's obsession with cyanide speaks to his desire for control and efficiency. By experimenting with new methods of murder, he was trying to elevate himself above other killers, turning his murders into a twisted art form. Louis Mazgai, the frozen corpse. Louis Mazgai was a businessman who found himself on the wrong side of Richard Kuklinski. Their relationship had started over some shady dealings involving bootleg tapes. But when Mazgai didn't hold up his end of the bargain, he sealed his own fate. The two men met on July 1, 1981, under the pretense of finalizing a business transaction. But Richard Kuklinski had already made up his mind. Mazgai would not leave the meeting alive. Instead of a simple kill, Kuklinski opted for something far more sinister. He shot Mazgai in the head with a .22 caliber pistol, ending his life instantly. But it wasn't the murder itself that made this case so notorious. It was what Kuklinski did with the body afterward. Richard transported Mazgai's corpse to a storage facility where he kept industrial-sized freezers. For the next 2 years, Mazgai's body remained frozen, a grotesque trophy that Kuklinski kept preserved for one reason: to confuse investigators. In September 1983, Kuklinski finally decided to dispose of the body. He dumped Mazgai's frozen corpse in a wooded area, assuming it would decay naturally. But there was one detail he didn't account for. When the authorities discovered the body, they immediately noticed something strange. Despite having been found during warm weather, parts of Mazgay's body were still frozen. This detail alone blew the investigation wide open, giving law enforcement the first real evidence of Kuklinski's method. This case perfectly demonstrates Kuklinski's cold, calculated nature. Freezing the body was not only practical, but a psychological statement. It was his way of proving that he was smarter than the authorities. The pleasure he derived from outwitting them was just as powerful as the act of murder itself. The arrest of Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman's icy downfall. By the mid-1980s, Richard Kuklinski had built a reputation as one of the most feared contract killers on the East Coast. His skill, secrecy, and versatility in murder made him the go-to hitman for various criminal organizations, especially the Gambino family. But while Kuklinski believed he was untouchable, his own arrogance and desire for control would ultimately lead to his downfall. The authorities had been circling around Kuklinski for years. Bodies with strange patterns of cyanide poisoning, frozen corpses, and other unusual elements started to raise red flags. But Kuklinski was careful. He rarely left evidence, and his preferred weapon of choice, cyanide, was practically untraceable. However, it was his increasingly reckless behavior that put him on law enforcement's radar. By the early 1980s, he had built a criminal empire involving drug trafficking, bootleg pornography, arms dealing, and contract killing. It was only a matter of time before the authorities began to notice the trail of bodies left in his wake. Operation Iceman, the sting operation. The official investigation that would finally bring Kuklinski down was known as Operation Iceman. It was led by Special Agent Dominic Polifrone of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF. Polifrone was a seasoned undercover agent who had successfully infiltrated various criminal organizations before. But this assignment would be his most dangerous yet. The operation began with the authorities building a profile on Kuklinski. They studied his past, his methods, and most importantly, his connections to the mafia. By 1985, they had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to justify a full-scale undercover investigation. The plan was simple but dangerous. They needed Kuklinski to openly discuss his methods of killing on tape. Polifrone posed as a hitman named Dominic Provenzano and, through an intermediary, managed to convince Kuklinski that he was looking for someone to help him carry out a hit. Polifrone's calm, street-smart demeanor won Kuklinski's trust over several months of careful interaction. The undercover meetings, the meetings between Polifrone and Kuklinski, were both nerve-wracking and fascinating. Kuklinski, ever the egomaniac, was eager to show off his expertise. He spoke freely about his methods, particularly his favorite, cyanide. He detailed how he would administer the poison by slipping it into drinks or using a nasal spray that released a fine mist, killing the victim almost instantly. During their conversations, Kuklinski also boasted about his body disposal methods, including his now infamous technique of freezing bodies to confuse investigators about the time of death. Polifrone listened intently, all while making sure their conversations were being recorded. The most damning evidence came when Polifrone proposed a hypothetical hit involving cyanide. Kuklinski agreed to the job and went so far as to explain exactly how he would carry it out. The undercover agent's recordings were finally the concrete proof authorities needed to move forward with the arrest. December 17, 1986. The operation reached its climax on the chilly morning of December 17, 1986. Authorities knew Kuklinski was unpredictable and dangerous, so they carefully planned a tactical arrest to minimize the risk of casualties. As Kuklinski left his house in Dumont, New Jersey, and got into his car, a team of officers swarmed the vehicle. He was surrounded and forced out of his car at gunpoint. His wife, Barbara, and their children watched in horror as the man they believed was a loving husband and father was taken away in handcuffs. Even during the arrest, Kuklinski remained eerily calm. His expression was one of indifference, as if he couldn't quite believe he had been outsmarted. But the evidence against him was undeniable. The interrogation. During the interrogation, Kuklinski was initially defiant. He denied everything, maintaining his facade as a family man who wouldn't harm anyone. But as the hours went on and he realized the authorities had tapes of his conversations with Polifrone, his demeanor began to shift. When questioned about his methods, he remained unemotional, even when describing horrific details. His cold, calculating nature was on full display. He admitted to several murders, though he was careful to avoid implicating himself in too many crimes. The trial and conviction. Richard Kuklinski's trial was a media spectacle. The courtroom was packed with journalists, psychologists, and curious spectators, all eager to catch a glimpse of the man known as the Iceman. The evidence presented by the prosecution was overwhelming. The tapes recorded by Polifrone were played in court, revealing Kuklinski's calm, matter-of-fact discussions about murder. The jury listened in stunned silence as Kuklinski casually described how he had killed people with cyanide, guns, knives, and even crossbows. On May 25, 1988, Kuklinski was convicted of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. His lack of remorse during the trial only cemented his reputation as a true psychopath. The chilling recordings, combined with testimony from Polifrone, made Kuklinski's guilt undeniable. Life in prison. Despite his grim situation, Kuklinski continued to show little remorse for his actions. He agreed to several interviews from prison, where he seemed almost proud of his criminal past. He openly spoke about his murders, his methods, and his complete lack of empathy for his victims. On March 5, 2006, Kuklinski died in prison from natural causes. Some conspiracy theorists speculate that he was killed to prevent him from testifying against powerful figures, but no concrete evidence has ever surfaced to support these claims. The arrest and subsequent interrogation of Richard Kuklinski reveal a man who viewed life and death as mere transactions. His ability to compartmentalize his life as a killer from his role as a husband and father is a hallmark of a psychopathic personality. His calmness during his arrest and trial suggests he believed himself to be untouchable until the very end.